for those who came, welcome to our seminar. That's the very last seminar of the year. So I do hope it's going to be a special event, not only because it's the last seminar between like us and New Year, but also because we have great guests here. And it's our pleasure to have here as a presenter who represent actually a big group of scholars who are the authors of this paper. And always, since we are also interested in institutional analysis, that's a great topic for us to discuss tonight. And we usually work as follows. We have about 30 to 40 minutes for presentation. And we ask you clarification questions during the presentation, and we have a discussion afterwards.
Okay.
So the floor is yours.
Sounds good. So thank you very much. My name is Israel Marques. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Social Sciences and at the International Center for the Study of Institutions and Development. So this paper is, as you can see, a co-authored work. It's a little bit different than the paper that was sent around and advertised, and I will tell you more about that in exactly one slide. But the group for this particular team is Irina, Levina, and my co-author Anton Kazun. Anton is here, as well as Andrei Yakovlev, all of which are at the Institute for Institutional Market Studies, as I remember, is our umbrella organization. So today, we're mostly actually going to be talking about a subpart of a larger project, which is this paper entitled Raiders, Property Rights, and Investment Evidence from Russia's Regions. Now, the sort of broader project that we're looking at looks at a much larger question about uncertainty and its effects on firms' choices to invest in the Russian regions. Now, in that project, we focus very much on this difference between written and unwritten rules as a source of uncertainty. So much of the work on investment and uncertainty focuses on the impact of regulations, whether you have more regulations, which in theory, through a long series of, through a long chain, leads to less investment, or more uncertainty, which comes from not only the uncertainty about the actual written form of the regulations, but actually how they'll be enforced and whether they're enforced in these things. And in the broader project, we focus on two forms of specifically unwritten rules. So not formal regulations and their enforcement, but actually just general aspects of the business environment. And specifically, we want to focus on corruption, right, as a sort of institution, albeit an unwritten one, as well as violent expropriation. Now, in doing this work, we wrote it, it was good. There's a World Bank preprint on it if any of you are interested in the broader project, but we really realized that there are actually two distinct things going on and two very distinct papers that should be written out of this. And so today, what we're going to focus on is mostly this question of violent expropriation, although if anybody's interested, we can talk a bit about corruption later. There are a couple of reasons for that. A lot of them have to do with just what we found most theoretically interesting, but also because there's some issues with the corruption data, and so we prefer to focus on the part of the project that we think is A, more theoretically interesting, but B, that we have a sort of empirical grasp on. So the motivation for looking at violent expropriation specifically is this general question of how does state-backed private expropriation shape investment? Now, hopefully, right, in an institute of people who do institutional analysis, there's no need to talk about the sort of seminal work of Douglas North and the new institutional economics, right? But if we look at specifically what they're interested in, right, they're mostly focused on direct expropriation of investment, specifically investment by business owners and firms, right, as done by state actors. Now we know from sort of another body of work, which is mostly qualitative in nature, focusing on Russia specifically, that state expropriation is a problem. But there's also this problem of private attacks by private businesses on each other. And what's particularly interesting in Russia is the fact that many of these attacks, what we will refer to as raider attacks in the rest of this paper, are actually carried out using the state as a tool. So this is quite different, right? You don't have state actors or the autocrat or whatever directly expropriating, right? You have private actors expropriating each other, but using the state, right? It's a form of state capture, but we will argue that it's actually even a bit more complicated than that. But it's precisely these dynamics that we're interested in. And so here, right, we want to examine whether state-sanctioned raiding, right, these attacks of private firms on other private firms, affect investment decisions and for whom. And so in the current version of the paper, we're mostly interested in identifying region-level effects. That is, do regions with greater instances of raiding have more or less investment than other regions? In the next version of the paper, we want to build on that, and we want to start looking at specific firm-level vulnerabilities, right? So not only do firms in regions with more raider attacks invest more or less, but which ones specifically are sort of identifying the effect leading to the effect. Unfortunately for this paper, there were some issues with that as well, and so we decided to focus mostly on this regional level analysis. So the theoretical puzzle here, again, is that this literature on property rights and investments is very focused on the state, right? So we all know that if we define institutions, as Douglas North does, as human constraints on human interaction, in general, this literature argues that weak constraints lead to expropriation of some, which leads to uncertainty, which leads to a lower desire to invest. Now, that general negative effect has been found to have sort of micro-level exceptions, right? Not all firms are equally vulnerable, so not all firms care, right? And so from the work of Haber and his co-authors, we know that firms that have sort of more asset mobility or that have heavy technical human capital requirements, they're less worried about expropriation than other firms. Similarly, we know from work on a large number of other countries that political connections are also potentially a way to break this relationship. Now, when we look specifically on Russia-centric work, right, that's specifically focused, again, on this idea of firms taking over other firms using the state as a tool, a lot of it looks at these attacks by private competitors that use law enforcement as an instrument, as a tool, right? So these are examples of where one businessman wants to take over the business of another. He convinces the local authorities to open up a tax case. Somebody goes to jail. While they're in jail, their company is taken from them. These sorts of situations. And so here, the sort of general argument is that weak rule of law, right, the fact that you can even do this in the first place, leads to this ability to raid, right, which leads to general uncertainty, which should decrease investment. Now, again, when we think about the new institutional economics, the origin of this effect is the state, right? It's not necessarily private actors. And so what we want to think about is whether the private origin of this raiding, even if the state is being used as a tool, should lead to the same sorts of effects, right? And then the second question, which again we don't address in this particular presentation, but we hope to do so in the final version of the paper, is whether your defenses against these sorts of raids are the same if the origin is from other private firms as it would be if the origin is the state. So when we think about state-sanctioned raiding in Russia, right, one of the big problems we have is sort of an endogeneity problem, right? What's causing what? The raiding doesn't just emerge. It emerges due to some enabling conditions, which we need to think about, right? Both in terms of formulating the theory, but also to deal with in our analysis, right? And so the enabling conditions that a lot of the literature in Russia identifies for these raider attacks are, first of all, the presence of healthy, profitable businesses, right, that you would want to take over in the first place. We also see that political loyalty is usually exchanged for impunity on the part of law enforcement. That is, Michael Rochlitz has a paper showing that in regions where united Russia wins by more, right, you also tend to find more of these raiding attacks. And the theory there is that because they're sort of politically loyal and promoting the needs of the federal regime, it turns a blind eye on them, and they're able to do as they wish. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is there's a lot of evidence, a lot of it qualitative, that suggests that law enforcement here is mostly acting independently of regional political authorities, right? So it's almost not really, one could think of it as a state within a state, right? Or a set of parallel structures. Now, in terms of restrictions, right, why do we not see this everywhere? In Russia, again, there are a couple of things that seem to be at play, right? The most important is this use of business associations as a means of collective action, collective defense to secure one's property, right? And this is by the work of Marques as well as Denisa Devanovna's relatively recent book. In addition to that, right, there are these sort of strategies of using these sort of collective public strategies of using sort of depersonalized institutions with wide membership bases, right? So here we're specifically not thinking about business associations per se, although these are obviously included to the extent that they're collective and depersonalized, but just more broadly about professional associations. And then finally, one could argue potentially that economic crisis may play into this as well, right? If economic crises ensue, that should lead to reductions in rents, and therefore it might change the nature of these sort of rating attacks. Now, with that sort of theoretical presentation out of the way, really the meat of this paper for us is empirical, right? First, we want to see if we can identify an effect. We would expect from the literature that the effect is negative. That is, the more rating we see in a region, the less likely there is to be investment. But this is an open question in our minds. It's something that we don't know if there's a lot of good micro-level data for. There certainly isn't in the literature that we reviewed. Although if anybody has any comments on this, please feel free to share. So in order to sort of tease out these relationships and figure out what's going on, we make use of two data sets, which we think are relatively unique. The first is a 2014 survey of firms carried out by our institute called the Russian Firms in a Global Economy Survey, or RUFIGI. And I'll say more about that in a second. And then the second, which I'll also talk about in 2 slides, is data from the Center for Public Procedures Business Against Corruption, which actually tracks instances of rating across the regions in Russia. And then, of course, as any good econometric analysis does, we introduce controls. They're from the sort of usual suspects. If anybody's dying to know something specific, let me know and we can tell you about it later. Okay, doing really well on time. So the RUFIGI survey, it's a sample of 1,950 mostly manufacturing enterprises. And it was conducted by HSC, the Institute for Industrial Market Studies, from June to October of 2014. It covers 9 sectors in 60 regions. So unlike many of the firm surveys that one sees, specifically of Russia, the coverage is very, very wide, even though it's mostly focused on the manufacturing sector. It's also worth noting that of the manufacturing sector, the survey is reasonably representative. It's not perfect. We can talk about some of the deviations and how we expect that changes the generality of our findings, but it's a reasonable facsimile. And it does include firms of all sizes, although not micro-level firms. So if they're less than 10 employees, it's not in our sample. So some stylized facts about the sample that we conduct the survey, or the sample of the survey. The average size of firms here is about 100 employees. 40% of these firms claim to have implemented investment in the period from 2011 to 2013. So not everybody, but a reasonable number of them. 15% of these firms note that they receive some form of support from the government. Here we mean direct support, not necessarily contracts. 20% of them have executed some form of public procurement contract, however. And then finally, about 2% of them are state-owned firms and 2% of them are foreign-owned firms. Okay. So this data on rating, which is the main, where we draw our main independent variable from, and we think is sort of the real empirical contribution of this paper. It comes from this large NGO called Business Against Corruption, which created this sort of registry. Now, it was founded by Business Russia, Delovaya Rossiya, in February of 2011. Interestingly, however, it was founded with the support of very high-level officials in the federal government. And the sort of main goal of this NGO is specifically to help defend businesses against unlawful prosecutions, as well as these raiding attacks, right? Attacks by other firms. And the sort of main channel by which they do this is to have public hearings that they hope will attract the attention of high-level officials in law enforcement and sort of get them to intervene directly. So this is very much a ручное управление model of, you know, dealing with your business investment climate problems. Okay, so the registry itself, right, is a sort of a technical instrument. It basically collects all of the complaints that are made to this public organ. And specifically, it collects data on the initiation of criminal cases, the types of business activities that the firms involved in the case are working on, and then the specific region that it's located in. Now, what's interesting is from 2011 to 2013, which is the period that overlaps our main dependent variable, right? A question in that firm survey on investment. We have about 600 reports. It's important to note, though, that most of them are not from manufacturing firms. So Antoine can say a lot more about this than I can, but my understanding is a lot of this is, right, it's English, retail, right, retail firms. So we cannot say that this exactly captures the environment for manufacturing firms, right? There's a lot of other things going on here. What we argue, however, is that this variable helps us to capture something about the general uncertainty of property rights in the region, right? Not specific to manufacturing, but in general to the region itself. And again, you know, if we want to believe our Douglas North and we want to apply it to actions that are originated by private actors, in theory, right, this general uncertainty about property rights and whether you're going to get attacked should lead to less investment. And that's the argument we want to make. But again, in terms of interpretation, it's very important to point out here that this is not a direct signal to the manufacturing firms, right? It's something more general about the business environment of the region. Okay, so this is to give you just a general sense of what the data look like. So our main independent variable that we draw from that registry is the number of complaints in each region normalized by GRP. Why do we do that? We do that because obviously one can imagine that in a region like Moscow, which has a very large GRP and a lot of businesses, there are going to be a lot more complaints, all else being equal. Whereas you can think of, like, I don't know, Еврейский автономный округ or a place like that where there's very little, comparatively speaking, you might see a small number. So we just want to normalize so that we're comparing apples to apples here. Again, this is the distribution. You can see that there are quite a number of regions here at 0, but then we get sort of a large spike at the lower end of the distribution, and then we have a couple of regions with very large amounts. Again, keeping in mind that these are already normalized, right? So this is going to vary between 0 and 3. Now the mean here is 0.12, the standard deviation is 0.8, so we can see a lot of variation. One thing we can talk about later is that this is potentially a concern, right? All these zeros. We could imagine that there are regions where everything is wonderful and nobody raids and people factually correctly report a 0 effect. We could also imagine regions where firms are afraid to be seen reporting to any sort of NGO, right? Or sort of rocking the boat in any way, and therefore we get these zeros out of fear, right? We could also imagine regions where entrepreneurs know that going through this registry process is totally useless because no one's going to intervene and nobody in regional law enforcement cares at all, right? So we should keep in mind that here there is some potential for measurement error, right? And specifically for some sort of selection effect based on this. And we'll talk more about how we attempt to deal with that. But generally, this is something that we're very interested in. If people have ideas of what could be driving this, how one could tease it out a little bit better than what we've done, we're very happy to hear about those. Okay. So the model itself is a standard probit model. There's the functional form. If there's anybody here who's gaga over econometrics, I'm not, so I'll skip this, although if there's interest, we can talk about it later. So the dependent variable is a dummy equal to 1 if the firm claims to have made a capital investment from 2011 to 2013 and 0 otherwise. So this is taken directly off of our Rufiji survey, where they're literally asked this question: did you engage in some sort of capital investment during this 2-year period? Our main independent variable of interest is, again, this measure of the frequency of raider attacks normalized by GRP. And then finally, because this is sort of a probit model, and because our main variable of interest is a regional level measure, right, we can include fixed effects. So what we need to do is to attempt to include a couple of regional level controls just to sort of deal with the most obvious forms of omitted variable bias. We can talk more about other ways of doing this that we will try in the future, but this is what we do for this particular paper. So specifically, we want to account for initial economic conditions in the regions, and we do that by using the log of GRP per capita in 2008, right, as well as log transfers from federal to regional budgets per capita in 2008. Again, with the rationale here that we want to capture the situation in the regions both before the crisis, but also before this investment takes place, right? This is sort of your legacy of the institution, of the economic structure of the region. In addition to that, we include a large number of firm level controls. These are all taken off of our Rufiji survey. So specifically, we include log employment, log age, the type of locality that the firm is located in, whether they take state orders. This is cut off, but it should say whether they're supported by the state. So usually that means they received some sort of aid program, either under one of the direct sort of federalni celovi projekti, or some of the regions have their own sort of development programs. I think by 2011, we're no longer seeing any of the anti-crisis programs, though, in play. In addition to that, we also look at whether they have deficits of qualified workers, their property type, the sector they're in, and then specifically getting at things that matter for our sort of Northian conception, right, of institutions and expropriation and how that would affect investment. We also control for whether they're a member of a business association, right? Again, arguing that if they can appeal to collective action, they may feel more confident in their investment. Finally, this is a typo. One of the major things we're worried about is just general corruption in the region as opposed to this sort of expropriation. So we include, for the part of the sample we can, a regional level measure of corruption, which I'll talk about in a second. Okay, so what do the econometrics look like? So our main results are here in column 1, right, which is looking at the full sample. So again, these are probit estimates, so the coefficients don't necessarily tell us a lot. But we see that there's a negative and statistically significant relationship between the number of complaints for raider attacks normalized by GRP and the decision of individual level firms to invest, right? It's only significant at the 10% level. We'll talk more about why we think that's the case in a second. Looking at the firm level controls, there's not really anything interesting here other than the fact that, as expected, if you're in a business association, you're more likely to invest. And interestingly, if you're receiving state orders, right, if you're getting federal procurement contracts, you're also more likely to invest. Also not surprising, but good to know. Now, we wanted to look at whether or not corruption matters for investment, whether once we control for corruption, right, we see that our effect goes away. Because the simple and most likely argument for why firms are not investing in these regions is they're just horribly, horribly corrupt. So if we can control for corruption and we get an effect, it's more evidence that actually the relationship we're observing is specifically about this uncertainty of property rights, this violent expropriation. So we use from the beeps 2 measures of this corruption. I would need to actually look up offhand what they are. One of them, I think, is just the usual question about whether you've taken a bribe, whether you need to take bribes, or firms like yours need to take bribes to get things done. The second, I think, is actually have you paid a bribe. So these are regional averages that we put together, and we see that, you know, our effect continues to hold. Now, it's important to note that beeps doesn't cover all of the regions covered by Rufiji. In fact, it covers, I think, about half of them. So our sample size, you can see, goes from 1,500 firms to 1,200 here. And so this is one of the things that actually led us away from our original paper, where we're looking at both this violent expropriation, but also uncertainty and corruption. So not just the regional mean of corruption, but the coefficient of variation. Actually, I'll get to that in a second. And this is why, right? So of our sample, right, 35 regions from Rufiji are covered by beeps, right? And 25 are not. But if you look, you can see that the regions that are not are really different from the regions that are, right? Like there's less urban population, the GRP is much smaller, the number of firms is much smaller, right? My apologies. If I were one of my students, I would have been kicked out of class, so deepest apologies for that. Okay. So you can see, right, that difference that we saw here, right, it could be the case that, look, we control for corruption, our results get a lot better. It could be something about this specific Rufiji sample, right? And it's very difficult for us to tell. So hold that thought in your minds for about a minute. I just want to show you, though, looking specifically at this model and looking at the substantive effects, right? Because one might ask, great, you found something, there's a coefficient, there are a bunch of stars. Does this actually matter in the real world? So this is actually looking at the estimated probability of investment at sort of low, medium, and high intensity of raider attacks, right? So medium here is the mean, and then we look at one standard deviation below and one standard deviation above, right? We see that the probability of investment for the average firm across all of our control variables is about 45%, right? If we go to the mean on raider attacks, it goes down to 41%. And then if we look at regions with very high levels, it's about 37%, right? So this is substantively actually quite large, we think. Okay. So caveats and reservations abound in this type of paper, right? But specifically in this one. So one thing that we should note, and this is sort of inside baseball. So one of our co-authors, specifically Andrei Alexandrovich Yakovlev, actually participated to some extent in the discussion of these beep surveys. And one of the things that he noted to us is that selection into the Russian beeps that we use here is not actually random. They didn't just take regions and then off the dartboard, they didn't stratify, they didn't do anything. They basically went to the regions and asked if the regional authorities were willing to cooperate, right? And if they were willing to cooperate, then they were included in the beep sample. If they weren't, they were not, right? And the problem here is we don't know what determined that willingness to cooperate in the first place. So if we just look at these beep samples, there's clearly some sort of selection bias going on. For this paper, that's particularly a problem if we really believe that we need to be controlling for corruption. For the broader paper, which the World Bank working paper, which you all saw, it's actually potentially a challenge to the entire result. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to focus on this paper specifically rather than that one. The other thing is, as I mentioned before, right, there's some evidence of non-random noise in the independent variable itself, right? So there are several regions with no reports, and this is potentially a source of either omitted variable bias or selection bias, or both of which are problems for obvious reasons. And then finally, just in general, right, here we've used a standard, sorry, that should say probit model, with a limited number of regional controls, right? And so that leaves open the possibility of even more omitted variables, right? So specifically, one can think about the role of political management or effectiveness, right, in the regions, either for the regional government or for the security services themselves, right? We can think about the role of political connections in the regions, again, with both groups. One can think about the informal market as well, civil society, and in general, the asset structure, the industrial structure and the asset mobility of firms in the region. So there's a lot to worry about. One thing I would say here, so again, this particular paper is at a very early stage. We're not quite sure how we're going to deal with this. So one thing we're currently exploring is looking at whether we can instrument for this business against corruption measure. The problem with that, as you can imagine, is that likely the causes of people rating in regions are probably heavily tied to the decisions of firms to invest, right? So we're a little bit worried about the exclusion restriction. The other form of model that we're interested in using here is taken very much out of political science, which is using what's called the multi-level model, right? So multi-level models, for those of you who are econometricians, they're very similar to random effects models. The difference, however, is when you estimate this type of model, you can allow individual variables to vary across regions, and you can allow for basically a sort of the intercept for the regions to vary. Now that varying intercept, at least in political science and work of this nature, is commonly interpreted as more or less a fixed effect, right? It should be capturing a lot of the variation that's specific to the regions, but is not actually captured in the explicit parts of the models themselves. We poked around a little bit with this. The results seem to hold, but we did that relatively recently, and that sort of regression model is a bit complicated, and so we're not ready to hang our hat on those results yet. It is promising, though. So in terms of the broader implications, right, it's worth noting that we do find a relationship, right? We cannot say that it is causal, but we can say that there is some correlation between the willingness of individual firms to invest and the presence of rating in the region. And it's a negative relationship. The more rating, the less investment. Although, again, I don't know if you guys are as militant about causal inference as my colleagues in the United States generally are. So we note that here this is mostly at the level of correlations. But in terms of the policy implications, right, assuming this finding is true, we think there's a lot of interesting things that are going on, right? So first, one could argue that predatory policing seems to be an issue at middle levels of economic development, right, where we find ourselves at in contemporary Russia. Now, what's interesting is, again, to the extent that our paper here and our data show a relationship between the use of law enforcement as a tool to violently expropriate other firms, right? It's important to note that this is not a regional level issue because these law enforcement agencies are directly subordinated to the federal center, right? And so the sort of usual story that one hears from like the World Bank and others is, oh, if only we could get the regions to better police and to improve their business climate, things would be better. Not here, right? The regions can do what they want, but as long as the law enforcement bodies are independent of regional governments, it doesn't quite solve this specific problem. The other thing to note, though, is that this large regional variation in the intensity of raider attacks is potentially an important source of information for top-level decision-making, right? It helps the federal government to understand, like, oh, these regions have a problem, right? And so if you think that the solution here is to get the federal government more involved, the bright side is they don't really have to find any new measures, right? They already more or less have one that they can use here. And then finally, right, we can argue that the solution to this problem has a lot to do with promotion incentives of law enforcement itself and the sort of human resources side of the equation, right? If you can think of a sort of more Chinese model, right, where in China, right, officials are generally promoted in part because of political loyalty, yes, but also because they're concretely producing, right? They're producing economic development in the regions. If we were to find something similar for law enforcement, right, where suddenly these rating attacks are part of their KPIs, right, how they get promoted, then we might actually find a solution to this problem, right, just with the changes of the HR policies. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to field any questions that you may have.
So can I start with questions? So could you please introduce yourself?
Please accept my apology. Let me introduce myself. I am honorary reader of statistics of University of Wales in Britain and acting professor of statistics at this university. And I would like to know whether it is possible to clusterize, how we would say, to separate all Russian regions in clusters, such that you will believe that business environment is homogeneous inside the cluster. Okay, how many clusters you believe there is in Russia? So the standard statistics is if you have data, you try to separate them in some homogeneous groups, right? Which are called clusters.
Yeah, I understand the problem.
Whether you can demonstrate, say, a map of Russia, such that you say, okay, you have few colors, blue, green, yellow, and you believe that what is covered by some particular color is more or less homogeneous with respect to business friendly and friendly / environment. You understand?
I understand the question, but I think that you may misunderstand our measure. So personally, I would argue that clustering according to these sort of indices and categories is throwing away a lot of useful information. So the measure itself here is count data. It's continuous, right? And so because it's continuous, to attempt to put regions into these bins, right, risks a lot of, and this is implicit in your question, right? It risks the fact that our results will be colored by the decisions we make about those bins, right? So here, actually, we just let the measure be continuous, right? The data speaks for itself, right, to some extent. We wouldn't actually put regions into these are alike and these are not. They're only alike to the extent that we see similar numbers of reports, right, in the regions. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I also would sort of reject the approach of clustering in the first place.
That is not interesting for you. Okay, fine, thank you.
I mean, sorry, I would say this. Could it be done? Yes. I personally, for this sort of analysis, would worry about it. For an analysis where the dependent variable is rating, then clustering might be more useful. But because here rating is an independent variable, we want to just maximize our statistical power and try to avoid throwing away data.
Further questions, comments? So I would have a question on the firm sample. Could you say a few words about, did you look on the deeper in what types of firms you considered, and did you try to find out what are the most important characteristics of firms which might play a role here?
So at the first stage of the paper, we're mostly interested in identifying a regional level effect of some kind. And we do that mostly because, again, so in the World Bank paper, we find some very nice results. There are lots of stars. As we all know, you can get a lot of stars for for reasons that have nothing to do with the truth of the world, but just because of the way you specify your model, your sample, etc. So in this paper, once we started exploring with the sort of whole sample of refugee firms, we started seeing that the level of statistical significance for our result drops a lot. And that really concerned us. And so for us, the main thing we're focused on here is, do we find that statistically significant regional level effect? And then more importantly, once we found it, do we believe it, right? That this is a thing. Now, you're right that the extent to which rating will affect the choices of individual firms is likely an interaction, right? It's not just a broader regional level effect and not just firm level effects, but the interaction of the two. And that's actually the next place we want to go with this paper. So we haven't looked at it super carefully. We have a few sort of preliminary results. So Anton, you might correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, we find, for example, that the negative relationship here is attenuated by business association employment, for example. It's also very, very odd when you look at firms that do not report their property type. So here, firms were asked, what is your general structure? Do you have state-owned investment, foreign-owned investment, et cetera, et cetera? Some firms refuse to answer. And so for those firms, we also observe a sort of different effect here. But there we have the issue of we don't know who those firms are and why they don't answer. So there definitely are those effects, and that's the next step for the paper. But it's not something we focused on as much here. In terms of the sample itself, we again should be cautious because this is for manufacturing firms, right? Which more or less have sort of very fixed assets in one place, right? You can actually go to their factory and take it. It's not like taking over a food truck in Moscow or to some extent a restaurant, right? So it's worth noting that well, it's worth noting that one of the things we want to look at is that sort of effect of asset mobility as well, because in the literature this is hugely important. But it's worth noting that it might be difficult with this sample, and these results might sort of cloud over the fact that that matters, because again, these are all relatively large manufacturing firms, right? The average size is 100.
Because it just talk about like a couple of things which might potentially affect the results. First, do you have the firms in the sample which their location choice would be endogenous to factors that you consider? For example, if I mostly have for intellectual capital as assets, I can choose different regions to set up the firm, looking on different policy regulation issues in different regions. Unlike with a firm where I need to invest in specific assets which are tightly related to some regional resources and everything. So if you separate firms of the first type from the firms of the second type, you might look on their differences here. Okay, that might be one option. Another option you mentioned that you look on the fact that firm has state orders. I would just look not only 1-0 variable, if you look in this way, but firms might substantially differ in this regards as well. For example, some firms are just organized to work with state orders, and some firms get them with the competitive markets occasionally. That's two different stories. And the results might differ from this type of firms. So I would look at this more.
So in terms of endogeneity, I mean, I agree with you. That's again, you'll notice that I caveated my way all the way around these results, right? Because endogeneity is an issue here. We didn't actually think about endogenizing the location of the firm, though, so that's a good idea. We need to think carefully about how one would do that. So we do control for the location of the firm, but that doesn't account for the fact that they chose that location in the first place. In principle, right, if we instrument for our main IV, it should deal with that problem? Or do you think we need a selection? We probably need a selection model, right, of some kind?
Right, because if you have a firm which does write code, it doesn't matter where to install Office, and you can write code at any location, right? But if you just work with forestry, you need forests to work with, right?
No, I understand that. I'm just trying to think. So I agree with that point entirely. I'm just trying to think to the next step about sort of operationally how we deal with that in this data, right? Yeah. And so I'm just trying to think if that would, it sounds like that would actually be more of a selection model than anything else. Okay. In terms of the number of state orders, though, I also agree there. I mean, so the sort of, I think it was the second or third slide that we presented, there was a lot of discussion there about sort of sources of vulnerability. That's sort of the things that we're thinking about for the next step, right? So part of it is sort of your connection to the state, which one would get at through state orders. There's actually, I think, even a question specifically about political connections, whether you know people beyond the state orders. The thing there, though, is we're sort of curious what the nature of that effect would be, right? Because in this literature, firms that are less visible, right, where you don't know what their assets actually are less tempting because they just look smaller than they are. The problem is when you have a lot of state orders, on the one hand, potentially the state is ordering from you. That implies that you know people that might be a sort of defense mechanism, particularly from the regional government that's doing the ordering. On the other hand, the fact that you have all those orders, all of that is public information, right? So people can see how much money you're making. And so for us, it's particularly interesting because theoretically, it's not clear what the effect would be, right? So I 100% agree with you that that's something we want to look at.
One more issue is related to the age of the firm.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just look on their age in the way that, do you have any information about these particular firms in the previous reincarnation? Like firm is 2 years old, but the same owner has the same type of firm in a different region. move to another location. If it happens, to some extent, that might give you an idea that people just migrate with a business. Say you're somewhere on the border, right? You can easily like change your official location from one region to another one, just because some regions, like authorities, are more friendly in terms of policy, etc.
So unfortunately, the sample, as far as I know, is anonymous.
Okay.
I don't know if we have. No, so this is always an issue for me in Russia. So in the United States, the university where I was trained, you would never, ever, 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 ever break anonymity because the IRB would destroy you and you would get censured. That being said, we've had an instance in Russia where we worked with a firm that sent us a list of everybody they interviewed. We don't know if that was by accident or not. So here I don't know if it's possible because to look at whether firms are reincarnated or to look at specific owners, we would need to know what the firm is. And I don't know if we can do that. That being said, if Andrei Alexandrovich, if he comes in later, we can ask him because he mostly was responsible for the survey, so he would know a lot more than I would. I came in on this like sort of after the survey data had been collected. As far as I know, we were not sent a list.